In the early 1940s, the United States stood at a crossroads between fear and principle. The nation spoke of liberty, justice, and constitutional rights, yet, behind guarded fences and remote desert landscapes, a different story was unfolding. Thousands of American families were quietly removed from their homes, their lives disrupted overnight, not because of what they had done, but because of who they were. Neighbors vanished. Businesses were abandoned. Entire communities were uprooted with little explanation and no meaningful opportunity to resist. There were no trials, no individual accusations, and no proven acts of wrongdoing. Instead, suspicion became policy, and ancestry became evidence. This was not happening in secret enemy territory. It happened on American soil, under the authority of the U.S. government, during a time when the nation claimed to be defending freedom abroad. For decades, this chapter of history remained uncomfortable, often minimized, and sometimes forgotten. The question is not whether this happened, it did. The question is how a democratic society justified it, how ordinary systems allowed it, and what it reveals about fear, power, and civil rights under pressure. Tonight, we explore one of the most sobering episodes in U.S. history, the Japanese-American internment camps, a story of silence, displacement, and the cost of fear. To understand the Japanese-American internment camps, we must first understand the atmosphere of the United States during World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 shattered the nation's sense of security. Overnight, fear spread across the country, amplified by uncertainty, wartime propaganda, and racial prejudice that had existed long before the war began. Japanese immigrants had lived in the United States for generations, particularly on the West Coast. Many had built farms, businesses, and families. Their children were American citizens by birth, raised in American schools, fluent in English, and culturally American in nearly every way. Yet, despite this integration, suspicion lingered, fueled by decades of discriminatory laws and social exclusion. When war erupted between the United States and Japan, long-standing racial stereotypes resurfaced with renewed intensity. Public officials, media outlets, and political leaders began questioning the loyalty of Japanese Americans as a group, despite the absence of evidence supporting such claims. The fear was not based on individual behavior, but on collective identity. Military authorities argued that national security required decisive action. Intelligence assessments, many of which later proved exaggerated or unfounded, suggested the possibility of sabotage. In this climate, fear moved faster than facts. Constitutional protections that normally required due process were sidelined in favor of rapid, sweeping decisions. In February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order did not mention Japanese Americans by name, but it granted the military authority to exclude individuals from designated areas. In practice, this authority was applied almost exclusively to people of Japanese ancestry. What followed was one of the largest forced relocations in American history. Families were given days, sometimes hours, to prepare. Homes were sold at losses. Possessions were left behind. What had taken decades to build was dismantled in weeks. This decision was framed as a military necessity. But behind that framing were deeper questions about race, citizenship, and how fear reshapes democratic values during crisis. The process of internment began swiftly and with striking efficiency. Notices appeared in Japanese American neighborhoods ordering residents to report to assembly points. These orders were presented as temporary measures, but they offered little clarity about duration or destination. Compliance was expected, not debated. Families packed what they could carry. Photographs, clothing, and small personal items replaced furniture, businesses, and property. Many trusted that the government would protect their belongings. Others sold assets at a fraction of their value, knowing there was no realistic alternative. Initially, internees were sent to temporary assembly centers, often racetracks, fairgrounds, and livestock facilities hastily repurposed for human confinement. Conditions were crowded, uncomfortable, and unfamiliar. Privacy was minimal. Guard towers and fences became part of daily life. From there, families were transported to more permanent relocation centers, typically located in remote deserts or rural areas. These camps were administered by the War Relocation Authority, a civilian agency tasked with managing the growing population of displaced citizens and residents. Despite the controlled environment, internees attempted to create normalcy. Schools were established. Community organizations formed. Cultural traditions were preserved where possible. But beneath these efforts was the constant awareness that freedom had been suspended without trial. What made this moment particularly striking was its legality. The policy was challenged in court, yet upheld by the Supreme Court at the time, reinforcing the government's authority to act under perceived military necessity. The beginning of internment was not marked by chaos or rebellion. It was marked by compliance, driven by trust, confusion, and the hope that cooperation would lead to fairness. That hope would be tested repeatedly in the years that followed. Once the internment system was fully in place, silence became its strongest ally. The machinery of government moved forward with little public resistance, not because the policy was universally supported, but because the systems designed to question power were overwhelmed by fear and urgency. Wartime conditions created an environment where dissent was easily framed as disloyalty. The bureaucratic structure surrounding internment was carefully organized. Military authorities issued exclusion orders. Civilian agencies managed logistics. Courts deferred to executive judgment. Each institution performed its assigned role, and in doing so, responsibility became fragmented. No single entity claimed full ownership of the moral consequences. Legal challenges emerged almost immediately. Japanese American citizens questioned the constitutionality of their removal and confinement. Yet the courts, including the Supreme Court, largely upheld the government's actions. The justification rested on the concept of military necessity, a phrase broad enough to override individual rights without demanding concrete evidence. Behind the scenes, internal reports contradicted public claims. Intelligence assessments from the FBI and Office of Naval Intelligence indicated that Japanese Americans did not pose a widespread security threat. These findings were downplayed or ignored. Policy continued not because it was proven necessary, but because reversing it would require admitting error. Public discourse reflected this imbalance. Newspapers often echoed official statements, emphasizing national unity and sacrifice. Few outlets questioned the racial assumptions embedded in the policy. Japanese American voices were largely absent from mainstream platforms, not by choice, but by circumstance. Inside the camps, silence took on another meaning. Internees were discouraged from protest. Cooperation was framed as patriotism. Loyalty questionnaires introduced confusion and division, forcing individuals to declare allegiance to a nation that had confined them without due process. Systemic failure did not appear dramatic. It unfolded quietly, through forms, approvals, and routine administration. The internment camps functioned efficiently, and that efficiency masked injustice. What should have triggered alarm instead became normalized. This was not the failure of a single leader or agency. It was the failure of a system that prioritized order over rights, speed over scrutiny, and fear over fairness. The end of World War II did not immediately end the consequences of internment. When the camps finally closed, former internees returned to a world that had moved on without them. Homes were gone. Businesses had failed. Communities were fragmented. The disruption extended far beyond the years of confinement. Economically, the losses were devastating. Generations of accumulated wealth vanished. Land was sold under pressure or seized. Employment opportunities were limited, and discrimination persisted even after release. Recovery was slow and uneven, leaving lasting disparities. Psychologically, the impact was profound. Many former internees carried feelings of shame, confusion, and betrayal. Children who had grown up behind fences struggled to reconcile their identity as Americans with the experience of exclusion. Silence followed many families home, as discussing internment was painful and often discouraged. Socially, internment altered how Japanese Americans interacted with the broader society. Some sought assimilation at all costs, believing visibility invited danger. Others worked to preserve memory, determined that the injustice not be forgotten. These differing responses reflected a community navigating trauma without formal acknowledgement. the broader American public also changed. Trust in institutions eroded gradually as later generations revisited wartime decisions. Internment became a reference point in discussions about civil liberties, particularly during times of national crisis. The long shadow of internment is not limited to history books. It appears in policy debates, court rulings, and public memory. It challenges assumptions about who is protected under the law and when those protections can be suspended. Internment did not end when the fences came down. Its effects continue to shape lives, identities, and national conversations decades later. For many years after the war, the internment of Japanese Americans received limited public attention. It was referenced briefly, if at all, and often framed as an unfortunate but necessary wartime measure. This narrative persisted largely unchallenged. Change came slowly, driven by survivors, historians, and civil rights advocates who refused to accept silence as closure. Personal testimonies emerged, documenting daily life in the camps and the emotional toll of confinement. These accounts humanized what had previously been treated as policy abstraction. Academic research played a critical role. Scholars examined government records, revealing inconsistencies between public justifications and internal findings. Evidence showed that decisions were influenced more by racial prejudice and political pressure than by verified security threats. Media coverage expanded as these findings gained traction. Documentaries, articles, and public forums brought internment into national conversation. For many Americans, this was the first time the issue was explored in depth. Public reaction evolved from discomfort to recognition. While some defended the policy as a product of its time, others acknowledged it as a violation of constitutional principles. The debate itself marked progress. Silence had been broken. Japanese American communities organized for redress, seeking not only compensation, but acknowledgement. Their efforts emphasized education, remembrance, and accountability rather than retaliation. Exposure transformed internment from a footnote into a case study. It became a lens through which Americans examined the balance between security and liberty, and the consequences of allowing fear to guide policy. The formal end of the internment camps marked a logistical conclusion, but it did not resolve the deeper injustice. As Japanese Americans attempted to rebuild their lives, the federal government faced growing pressure to acknowledge what had happened. For years, official responses were cautious, often framed in administrative language that avoided moral responsibility. Gradually, however, change began to take shape. Former internees and their descendants organized, testified, and documented their experiences. Community leaders emphasized that the issue was not merely historical, but constitutional. The question was whether the United States would confront a violation of its own principles. In the 1980s, this pressure culminated in formal government review. A bipartisan commission was established to investigate the internment policy. After extensive hearings and archival research, the commission concluded that the camps were not justified by military necessity. Instead, they were the result of racial prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. This conclusion marked a turning point. It reframed internment not as an unavoidable wartime action, but as a preventable injustice. The acknowledgement carried weight precisely because it came decades later, after reflection rather than reaction. In 1988, the U.S. government issued a formal apology and authorized financial redress for surviving internees. While compensation could not restore lost property or erase trauma, it represented an official recognition of wrongdoing. More importantly, it set a precedent that the state could admit error and attempt repair. Educational reforms followed. Internment entered school curricula, museums, and public commemorations. What had once been minimized became documented and taught. The goal shifted from justification to remembrance. The aftermath of internment reshaped how the United States approached civil liberties during crises. It reinforced the idea that emergency powers must be temporary, justified, and subject to review. The lessons were institutional as well as moral. Change did not undo the past, but it altered the future. Internment became a benchmark against which new policies would be measured, a reminder written into the nation's conscience. The relevance of Japanese American internment extends far beyond World War II. It stands as a warning about how fear can distort judgment, even within democratic systems. The policy did not emerge from chaos, it emerged from order, legality, and popular support. Modern societies continue to face moments of crisis that test civil liberties. National security, immigration, and surveillance remain subjects of debate. Internment reminds us that constitutional protections are most vulnerable when they are deemed inconvenient. The story also challenges the assumption that rights are equally protected for all. It demonstrates how race, identity, and perceived otherness can influence who benefits from the law and who is excluded from it. For Japanese American communities, remembrance is not about resentment. It is about visibility and education. Memory becomes a form of protection, ensuring that future decisions are informed by past consequences. Internment also reshaped how courts, lawmakers, and citizens think about accountability. Later judicial opinions acknowledged the flaws in earlier rulings, signaling an evolving understanding of justice. While the original decisions were never fully overturned, their reasoning has been widely criticized. In public discourse, internment is often cited as a historical parallel when rights are restricted in the name of safety. These comparisons are not accusations, they are reminders. History does not dictate outcomes, but it offers guidance. The enduring relevance of internment lies in its clarity. It shows how quickly principles can erode when fear is normalized. And it shows how difficult it is to restore trust once it has been broken. Remembering this history is not optional. It is a responsibility carried forward by those who understand its implications. The story of the Japanese American internment camps is not a story of distant history. It is a story about choices made under pressure, justified by fear, and upheld by institutions that were meant to protect rights, not suspend them. Thousands of families lost more than freedom. They lost time, stability, and trust in the nation they called home. Their experience reminds us that injustice does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in legality and urgency. This history asks us to consider what it truly means to defend freedom. It challenges us to look beyond slogans and examine actions. Democracies are not defined by their ideals alone, but by how those ideals are upheld during crisis. Remembering internment is not about dwelling on guilt. It is about vigilance. It is about recognizing warning signs before policy becomes harm. It is about ensuring that fear never outweighs humanity. History speaks to us not through accusation, but through evidence. It leaves behind lessons, waiting to be acknowledged. As we move forward, the legacy of internment remains a reminder that liberty requires constant protection, and that silence, when faced with injustice, carries its own cost.
Thank you for watching.